This is a response to a video from Epydemic 2020 entitled Euthyphro's New Dilemma. In the video, Epydemic counters what he labels as a new version of the Euthyphro Dilemma presented by Sisyphus Redeemed. On a side note, if you aren't subscribed to Sisyphus Redeemed, I suggest that you check out his channel. I'll put a link below. He has made some excellent videos, including a series on the history and philosophy of science. Now, this isn't the first time that Epydemic has discussed the Euthyphro Dilemma in an attempt to show that it is a false dilemma. He argued this same thing in his video Euthyphro Dilemma. I responded to his video with one entitled Euthyphro, God, and Genocide, in which I argued that God's command to exterminate the Canaanites clearly demonstrates that morality could not flow from the nature of God. Here, I will address the argument from a different angle, divine command theory, or DCT. DCT tries to overcome the problem of moral objectivity exposed by objections such as the Euthyphro Dilemma. DCT attempts to do this by making our moral obligations solely determined by the commands that God issues. There are different versions of DCT that have been offered, each attempting to overcome some objection raised. In this video, I will only address the version of DCT that is being proposed by Epydemic. His version appeals to God's essential goodness. I will examine this version of DCT in light of the following question. What if God commanded the ritual torture and sacrifice of children? Although God may never have issued this command, wouldn't DCT make such a command morally obligatory to follow if God did command it? I suppose that Epydemic would object to my question by stating that God's perfect nature would not allow him to issue such a command. Since God is essentially good, it would be impossible for him to command the torture and sacrifice of children. Although this response may be satisfactory to some, it has some inherent problems such as those discussed in Wes Morriston's paper, What If God Commanded Something Terrible? In his paper, Dr. Morriston raises 3 issues that present difficulties for this version of DCT. I will discuss these in a moment, but let's first consider the following argument. Number 1, DCT makes all of God's commands morally obligatory. 2, God could command the ritual torture and sacrifice of children, hereafter known as X. If DCT is true, then X could be morally obligatory. 4, X could not be morally obligatory. 5, therefore, DCT is false. Any divine command theorist would have to accept premise 1 as absolutely true. Additionally, I suppose that most individuals who accept this version of DCT will also accept premise 4 as true. Since 3 and 5 follow their preceding premises, this leaves premise 2 as the most likely target of an attack. If God's essential goodness prohibits him from commanding X, then premise 2 is false, and the argument fails. This, of course, would leave those supporting this version of DCT very happy. However, before claiming that premise 2 is false, one must consider the following. First of all, let's consider God's omnipotence. I doubt there are many divine command theorists who want to give up the claim that God is omnipotent. However, I believe a strong argument can be made for saying that real omnipotence entails the ability to command X. And if God can command X, then premise 2 is true, leaving divine command theorists in unwanted territory. Now one might respond that although God has the ability to command X, he simply chooses not to. But then I ask, why? To which one might respond that God's essential goodness makes such a choice impossible. And this is the very problem. If God has true omnipotence, then shouldn't he be able to choose to command X? For example, if God A can do everything that God B can do and more, then wouldn't we say that God A is more powerful than God B? Now, if we can conceive of a being that can do everything that God can do plus command X, wouldn't this being be more powerful than God? And if such a being is conceivable, then God does not have the maximum conceivable degree of power, and from this we can conclude that he is not omnipotent. I believe it comes down to this. Either God is not omnipotent or premise 2 is true. The second consideration would be concerning God's transcendence. In addition to holding to God's omnipotence, most divine command theorists are unwilling to concede God's transcendence. However, God's transcendence presents a problem in that it makes him somewhat unpredictable. His reasons for doing things may be totally outside of our ability to comprehend. By the way, have you ever heard this argument before? To cover his basis, the divine command theorist may respond that God would not command X unless he had very good reasons for doing so, reasons that were wholly consistent with his essentially good nature. The problem is that if you accept God's transcendence, then you can't be sure that God doesn't have good reasons for choosing to command X. And if you can't be sure, I would argue that premise 2 is true. A final consideration would be God's sovereignty. If one uses God's essential goodness as a way to show why it is impossible for God to command X, then he or she must demonstrate what it means to say that God is good. If goodness were simply defined by God's commands, then it seems too easy for God to command X. All that would be necessary to make X good is for God to command X. This is why individuals such as Epydemic argue that good must be identified with God or God's nature. Things are then said to be good insomuch as they resemble the image of God, which is the essence of goodness. But this seems to raise issues that the divine command theorists are attempting to avoid. For instance, if we say that God, meaning the being God, is good, then don't we trivialize the statement that God is good? In this scenario, God is good simply because he is identical to himself. Consequently, he could command X and still be good. This appears to have the problem of emptying any meaning from the word good. Conversely, if we say it's God's nature that is good, well, some have argued that this is inconsistent with divine sovereignty. Consider this. Under this scenario, God's nature would appear to be a bundle of good-making properties which God perfectly instantiates. Here, God is necessarily good as long as he possesses these properties such as love, mercy, kindness, etc. But now it appears as if God's properties and not God set the standard for moral goodness. As long as God perfectly instantiates these properties, he is good. But even if there is no God, wouldn't humans who possess such properties themselves be considered good to the degree they possess them? This takes us back to where we started, the Euthyphro Dilemma. Is God good because he has these properties, or are these properties good because God has them? I think that Sisyphus Redeemed made an outstanding point in his video when he said that any attempt to split Euthyphro's horns will collapse back into the same dilemma. This certainly seems to be the case. Euthyphro presents a dilemma from which it is unlikely the Christian will ever escape. An objection to this argument might be that God is his nature, which is good. However, I'm not really sure exactly what this means. And it appears to take us back to problem 1, where we say that God is good because he's identical to himself. As I discussed earlier, this means that God could command X, and X would be good because God commanded it. Perhaps there is meaning in this that I just don't understand. So to quote Dr. Morriston, divine command theorists who assert that God cannot command X because he is essentially good need to provide a satisfactory account of God's moral goodness, one that gives it enough positive content to rule out the possibility of hideous divine commands, but does so without compromising the strong view of divine sovereignty that provides so much of the motivation for the DCT. In conclusion, let's go back to the argument presented at the beginning of the video. Individuals like Epydemic, who support the version of divine command theory that appeals to God's essential goodness, seem to be in a dilemma of their own. If they attack premise 2, they appear to do so at the expense of God's omnipotence, transcendence, and divine sovereignty. And if they don't attack premise 2, well, then DCT is false. I'll leave it to them to pick their own poison.